So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. We have 3 terms. We so far do not know how to factor if we have 3 terms. We know 4. So we are actually going to mathematically figure out how to split this 10x so that we could have 4 terms and not 3. To do that, we need to identify what A, B, and C are. A, B, and C represent the coefficients in the front of the terms. The A is always the coefficient in front of the x squared. Because there isn't a coefficient there, it's the secret ninja 1, so A is 1. B is always the coefficient in front of the x term, so my coefficient is 10. And C is always the constant at the very end, so my C is 16. We are going to use these 3 terms to mathematically figure out how to rewrite 10x. So I am telling you that you need something that is 8 times C. 8 times C is 1 times 16. 1 times 16 is 16. So I need to come up with all the ways that multiply to give me 16. Well, I know 1 times 16 is going to give me 16. A negative 1 times a negative 16 would give me 16. I did my ones. Now I'm going to try 2's. 2 times 8 gives me a positive 16. Negative 2 times a negative 8 also gives me a positive 16. Try your 3's. 3 actually doesn't work. Try my 4's. 4 times 4 gives me a positive 16. I also know a negative 4 times a negative 4 gives me the positive 16. I wrote all of the possible ways to come up and get 16. I started with my 1's, then went to my 2's. I tried 3's, but nothing times 3 would give me 16. Then I did my 4's. I know my list is done because I have started to repeat numbers. So these are all the ways to get 16, but we only want one of them. And how we determine which one is that one of these has to add up to B. B is my 10. So only one of these can add up to 10. So we're going to go through and we're going to figure out what each and every single one of these adds up to. 1 plus 16 is going to give me 17. That's not what we wanted. Negative 1 added to this negative 16 gives me a negative 17, not the 10 we wanted. 2 plus the 8 gives me a positive 10. Negative 2 plus a negative 8 gives me the negative 10. You said 3's didn't work. 4 plus 4 gives me 8. Negative 4 plus negative 4 gives me a negative 8. Only one of them gave me the 10 that I needed. These two numbers right here multiply to give me the 16, and they add together to give me the 10. This is important because these two numbers are going to be how we split this 10x. So I keep this x squared. I'm going to rewrite 10x as this positive 2, and I know they're x's because we were talking about x's, and then this positive 8x plus 16. So this plus 2 and this plus 8 would actually simplify down to plus 10. So these are the same thing. We got these numbers from our list. So every single time we get a trinomial, a 3-term, you have to come up with a list to find the one term that works so you can split it. Now from previous lessons, we know how to factor if there are 4 parts. So we're going to get our area model. Remember the first one comes up here, and then you walk through, and then you walk through. I need the GCF for the top. X squared and 2x have an x in common. The minute I find the 1, I just go around and multiply. X times x is the x squared. X times 2 gives me my 2x. 2 times 8 is going to give me my 16. And x times 8 gives me my 8x. So I know that I have x plus 2. He's factor 1. And I have x plus 8. He's factor 2. And this is my final answer. I factored my trinomial by splitting the middle into 2 parts. It's important to find the right 2 parts using your list. Once I have my 4, I put them in the area model and I factor to find my 2 factors. So we're being asked to factor a polynomial. I have 3 terms. I don't know how to factor if it's 3 terms, so we are going to try to find 2 numbers that would allow us to rewrite the 7x. So we would actually have 4 terms. So to do that, we have to identify A, it's the number in front of the x squared. Identify B, he's the number in front of x. And identify C, he's the constant. To be able to figure out what numbers these split into, we need to do whatever 8 times C is going to add up to B. A times C is 6. So 1 times 6 was 6. I need to find what two numbers multiply to give me 6, but only one of those numbers is going to add together to give me the 7. So start with ones. 1 times 6. Does 1 times 6 add together to give me my 7? It actually does. 1 plus 6 is 7. So my list was short this time. I quickly found two numbers that multiply to give me the 6, and when I add them together, I get the 7. So that meant that I'm going to rewrite this number. So I have my x squared. I'm going to rewrite him as a plus 1x and a plus 6x. And then this plus 6 stays here. I rewrote the plus 7x using the two numbers over here that I found. Now that it's a 4-part polynomial, I can factor it using my area model. So x squared, 1x, 6x, and 6. GCF from the top is at x. The minute I find the one GCF, I go around and multiply. X times x is x squared. X times 1 is the 1x. 1 times 6 is the 6x. 6 times x is 6x. So this side is one of the factors, and this side is the other factor. So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. I have 3 terms in my polynomial. I don't know how to factor it if it's 3. I want to mathematically figure out how to rewrite the middle so it's 4. So this x squared is going to stay as an x squared. This plus 12 is going to stay as a plus 12. I'm going to try and figure out some way to rewrite the minus 8x using 2 terms, so I actually end up having 4 terms in total. So how we do that is we need to identify A. A is the number in front of x squared. Identify B. B is the number in front of x, that's a negative 8. And C is the constant, which is a positive 12. I have some A times C. A times C is 1 times 12. So I need 2 numbers that multiply together to give me 12, but one of them has to add together to give me my B. My B is a negative 8. If you can't come up with the 2 numbers on the top of your head, you're just going to make a full list. So start with your ones. 1 times 12 does give me 12, but when I add these together, I get a 13. I don't get the negative 8 that I need. Well, there's a negative 1 times a negative 12 would also multiply to give me 12, but if I add these together, I get a negative 13. The ones didn't work, so then you try the 2's. 2 times 6 multiply to give me 12, but when I add these together, I get an 8. I needed a negative 8, not a positive 8, so I'm close. Well, what about a negative 2 times a negative 6? Negative 2 times a negative 6 multiplied to give me positive 12. And when I add them together, I do get the negative 8, which is what I needed. So I just found these are the 2 numbers that I need to put into this square. So that's a minus 2. So here's my minus 2. And because we were splitting x's, it's an x. That's a minus 6. So here's my minus 6. And because we were splitting x's, it's an x. So we kept the outside 2 original terms. I rewrote the middle term using what I found in my list. So now that I have 4 parts, I know I can factor it using the area model. So looking at the top, there's a GCF of an x. So if he's x, x times x is going to give me x squared. X times a negative 2 gives me a negative 2x. Negative 2 times a negative 6 gives me the positive 12. X times negative 6 gives me a negative 6x. So now that I found my sides, this side is factor 1, and this side is the other factor. So I just factored my trinomial. So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. There are 3 terms. I don't know how to factor 3 terms. I know how to factor 4, which means we need to mathematically figure out how to split this middle in so that we actually have 4 terms. So the w squared is going to stay as a w squared. The plus 3 is going to stay as a plus 3. I want to rewrite minus 4w as 2 separate terms so that I end up having 4 terms in the end. So we need to figure out what these 2 terms are. So to do that, we have to identify our ABCs. A is always the number in front of the squared part, so this is a 1. B is always the number in front of the exponent of a 1 part, so this is a negative 4. And C is always the constant, so it's a 3. So 8 times C, somebody better add up to B. A times C, that's 1 times 3. So I need two numbers that multiply to give me 3, but when I add them, I get a negative 4. Always start with 1. So I know 1 times 3 is going to multiply to give me 3, but when I add these together, I get a 4. That's not the negative 4 that I needed, but I'm really close. So what about a negative 1 times a negative 3? I know if I multiply these two together, I do get a positive 3. If I add these two numbers together, I end up getting a negative 4, which is the number that we wanted. So I just found the two numbers that I need to use in here. So that's a minus 1. So here's my minus 1. And since we were splitting W's, it's a W. That's a minus 3. So here's my minus 3. Because we're splitting W's, he's a W. So I now have 4 terms. Since I now have 4 terms, I know I can factor using my area model. So the first one comes up here. And we're just going to walk on through. The GCF for the top is W. W times W is a W squared. W times a negative 1 is a negative 1W. Negative 1 times a negative 3 is a positive 3. W times negative 3 is a negative 3W. So now that I found my sides, this side is one of the factors, and this side is the other factor. So we just factored our original trinomial by making it a 4-part and then using our area model. So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. We don't know how to factor polynomials with 3 terms. We know how to factor polynomials with 4 terms. So we're going to mathematically figure out how to rewrite this middle term so that we would end up having 4 terms in the end. So the x squared is going to stay as an x squared. This minus 21 is going to stay as a minus 21. We want to figure out how to rewrite this plus 4x so that we end up having 4 terms. To do that, you have to identify your ABCs, where A is always the number in front of the x squared, so it's 1. B is always the number in front of x, he's 4. C is always the constant, so that's a negative 21. So somebody multiplies to get A times C, and somebody has to add up to B. A was 1, C was a negative 21. 1 times a negative 21 is a negative 21. So we need to come up with all the ways to multiply together to get negative 21. But only one of those ways is going to work, because only one of those actually adds up to the 4 that we need. So start with 1. So a negative 1 times 21 or 1 times negative 21. These are the 2 different ways to use 1, and they multiply to give me a negative. One of the numbers has to be negative. So we found our 1's. Now try 2. 2 times, well, nothing times 2 would give me 21. So this doesn't work. So then we try 3. 3 times, it would be 7. So either the 3 is the negative or the 7 is the negative. Try 4. 4 times nothing gives me 21. Then you try 5. Nothing times 5 will give me 21. Try 6. Nothing times 6 will give me 21. 7. I already have a 7 on the paper. So this is actually a repeat, which means you can stop your list, which means these 4 are the only ways to multiply together. So let's see what they add to. Negative 1 and 21 add together to give me 20. 1 and a negative 21 add together to give me a negative 20. Neither of these are the 4 that we need. Negative 3 and 7 add together to give me 4. 3 and a negative 7 add together to give me a negative 4. Only one of them gave me the 4 that I needed. Right here, negative 3 and 7 both multiplied to give me negative 21 and added to give me the 4 that I actually needed. So that's a negative 3. So here is my negative 3. And since they were x's, there's an x there. That's a positive 7. And since they were x's, there's an x there. So I split 4x into a minus 3x plus 7x. Notice how this simplifies to 4x. Now that I have 4 terms, I can do my area model. Start up front here, and I'm just going to walk on through. The top, my GCF is an x, so x times x is an x squared. X times a negative 3 is a negative 3x. Negative 3 times 7 is a negative 21. 7 times x is a 7x. So now that I found my sides, I found my 2 factors. One side is one factor. The second side is the other factor. And this is my final answer. I just factored my polynomial. So we're being asked to factor the polynomial. I have 3 terms. I don't know how to factor if I have 3 terms. I only know how to factor if I have 4. So we need to mathematically figure out how to rewrite this middle so we have 4. So the x squared is going to stay as an x squared. The minus 15 is going to stay as a minus 15. I want to figure out what two terms could I rewrite 2x as so that it would actually work for the problem. Now you can't just come up with any two that you want. There's a very specific method. So first you have to do is you have to find a, b, and c. A is always the number in front of the x squared, so a is 1. B is always the number in front of x, so b is 2. C is always the constant, so c is a negative 15. So we need to do a times c. Somebody better add up to b. So a was 1, c was a negative 15. So we're trying to figure out what two numbers multiply to give me negative 15, but when I add them together, I end up getting b, which was a 2. So start with 1. I know that negative 1 times 15 is going to multiply together to give me the negative 15, but if I add these two numbers together, I get a 14, not the 2 that I needed. So maybe the negative's on the wrong one. So 1 times a negative 15. These multiply together to give me negative 15, but when I add them, I get a negative 14, which is not 2. So those don't work. So then you would try 2. Nothing times 2 is going to give me negative 15, so 2 didn't work at all. Now 3. 3 times, I know it's 5. So either negative 3 times a 5 gives me a negative 15, or the negative was on the 5. So if I add these together, I get a 2. If I add these together, I got a negative 2. I needed a positive 2. So that means that I need to use these two numbers right here. These are the only two numbers in the world that will multiply to give me negative 15, but add to give me 2, which means these are the only two numbers you are allowed to use in this square right here. So that's a minus 3, and because we were splitting the x's, that's an x. That's a positive 5, so here's my plus 5. Because we're splitting x's, that's my x. So now that I have 4 terms, I'm going to use my area model. So he's an x squared. We're going to walk on through. Now we just need to find our GCF. The GCF to the top is x. X times x is x squared. X times a negative 3 will give me the negative 3x. Negative 3 times 5 will give me this negative 15. And x times 5 gives me the 5x. So now that I have my two sides, I have my two factors. The first side is one factor. The second side is the other factor. And you just finished factoring your polynomial.